Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
So, here's the deal. My parents gave my brother a house as a gift. At first I thought, wow, that's generous of them. And honestly, I was happy for him. My brother had never been the most responsible person, but I figured this could be a turning point. Maybe he'd finally settle down and get his act together. The house was in a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy, but still a big step up from the cramped apartment he'd been renting. For a brief moment, I thought, good for him. But then the cracks started to show. The house wasn't paid off, not even close. It came with a massive mortgage that my parents somehow decided to take on themselves. They framed it as no big deal, saying they wanted to help him get started. I tried to wrap my head around it. My parents, who were supposed to be planning for retirement, were now responsible for a mortgage on top of their own bills. Even that might have been okay if it ended there. But, of course, it didn't. A couple of weeks after the big housewarming celebration, I started getting weird calls from my mom. At first, they were casual, questions about my job, how much I was saving, little things like that. But soon, she started hinting at something bigger. You know, your brother's had a tough year, she said one evening. We've all had to make sacrifices. I didn't think much of it until the phone calls escalated. It turned out the house was only the beginning. My brother had racked up a mountain of debt, credit cards, personal loans, and who knows what else. My parents had been quietly bailing him out for years, but the house tipped them over the edge. They were drowning, struggling to make ends meet, and now they needed a solution. That's when they dropped the bombshell. We were thinking. My mom began hesitantly during yet another phone call. Maybe you could help us out. Just a little. I asked what she meant, and she finally admitted it. They wanted me to co-sign a loan so they could consolidate all my brother's debts and keep the house afloat. At first, I thought it was a joke. Who asks their other kid to shoulder a financial burden like that? But they were dead serious. My dad even tried to frame it as an opportunity, saying it would help the family stay strong and that I'd be doing the right thing. They both kept throwing around words like family loyalty and sacrifice, like I owed them something. The thing is, they hadn't really been there for me in the same way they were bending over backward for my brother. Growing up, I was the responsible one. The one who got good grades, stayed out of trouble, and helped out around the house. My brother, on the other hand, always seemed to get a free pass. Whenever he messed up, my parents swooped in to save the day. And now, they were asking me to clean up his mess. I told them no. Flat out, no hesitation. I said, I've worked too hard to build my credit and save for my own future. I can't risk it all for his mistakes. My mom sounded stunned, like she couldn't believe I was refusing. She said, we've always done so much for you. This is just one thing we're asking for. My dad was even worse. He got quiet, then said in this cold, disappointed voice, we thought we raised you to care about family. It felt like a slap in the face. I wanted to yell, what about everything I've done for you? What about all the times I put my life on hold to help out? But instead, I just repeated myself. I can't do it. I hung up feeling like the worst person in the world, even though I knew I'd made the right decision. A few days later, my mom called again, this time in tears. She said they didn't know how they were going to manage everything without my help. She talked about how hard it had been for them to keep everything afloat and how they just wanted to give my brother a chance to start fresh. I felt for her. I really did. But I couldn't get past the unfairness of it all. Why was it my responsibility to fix a mess I didn't create? And more importantly, why wasn't my brother being held accountable? Things were tense after that. My parents stopped calling as much, and when they did, the conversations were short and awkward. My brother, on the other hand, didn't seem to care at all. He didn't thank me for even considering it or apologize for putting us all in this situation. He just went on with his life like nothing had happened, while I was left feeling like I'd somehow let everyone down. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the loan or the house. It was about years of favoritism, misplaced loyalty, and the pressure to always be the good child. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I even wanted to be part of this family dynamic anymore. Growing up, it was always clear that my brother was the golden child. He could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, even when he blatantly screwed up. He'd come home with CS and DS on his report card, and they'd excuse it by saying, he's just not a school person. Meanwhile, if I brought home anything less than an A, I'd get a lecture about wasting my potential. The double standard didn't stop there. He was the kid who could break curfew without consequence, crash their car and get a replacement, and even get kicked out of college for partying too hard without so much as a serious reprimand. Every mistake he made was brushed off as a learning experience. Me? I was the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who always followed the rules. I worked hard in school, got into a good college, and even worked part-time jobs to help cover expenses when I saw my parents struggling. I never asked for handouts, even when I probably could have used one. It wasn't like I resented helping them out. I wanted to. But the way they treated my brother compared to me always left a bad taste in my mouth. So, when they came to me asking for help with this loan, it wasn't just about the money. It was about years of feeling like I was second place in a two-person race. My parents were asking me to risk everything I'd built, my credit, my financial stability, my future, to clean up yet another one of my brother's messes. And to make matters worse, they didn't even ask him to take any accountability for it. I told them no. Plain and simple. I wasn't going to do it. I've worked too hard to build my credit and save for my own future, I said. I can't risk it all for his mistakes. I expected them to push back, but I wasn't prepared for just how hard they'd come at me. My mom was the first to react. She burst into tears, accusing me of being heartless and ungrateful. We've always done so much for you, she sobbed. This is how you repay us? My dad, ever the stoic type, just sat there with his arms crossed and this look of disappointment on his face. Finally, he spoke. We thought we raised you better. It felt like a punch to the gut. I'd spent my whole life trying to make them proud, getting good grades, landing a stable job, staying out of trouble, only for them to turn around and act like I was the black sheep of the family because I didn't want to take on a debt that wasn't mine. I tried to stay calm, but my voice cracked as I said, this isn't about not caring. It's about being realistic. I can't jeopardize my future for a situation I didn't create, but they weren't hearing me. My mom just kept crying, and my dad shook his head like I'd somehow betrayed them. The worst part wasn't even their reaction. It was how fast the narrative shifted. Within days, they started calling me selfish and ungrateful in conversations with other family members. My aunt called me one evening to lecture me about helping out during hard times. She didn't know the full story, of course. My parents had framed it as though they just needed a small favor, and I'd coldly turned them down. I could feel the years of resentment bubbling up as I tried to explain myself. This isn't about a small favor, I told her. They're asking me to co-sign a loan to pay off tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Debt that isn't mine, but she wasn't really listening. She just kept saying things like, it's family though, and sometimes you have to make sacrifices. That word, sacrifices, really stuck with me, because it seemed like I was the only one in the family who was ever expected to make them. My brother certainly wasn't sacrificing anything. In fact, he barely seemed to register what was happening. When I asked him about it directly, he just shrugged and said, they're the ones making a big deal out of it. I didn't ask them to get involved. His indifference was infuriating. Not only had he caused this mess, but he didn't even seem to care that our parents were sinking deeper into debt trying to fix it. And yet, somehow, I was the bad guy for refusing to clean it up for him. The whole thing felt like a lose-lose situation. If I said no, which I had, I'd be branded as selfish and ungrateful. If I said yes, I'd be putting my own financial stability on the line for a problem that wasn't mine to solve. It was exhausting, and it made me question whether my parents truly valued me as a person or just as a resource they could tap into whenever my brother messed up. What hurt the most, though, was how quickly they seemed to forget everything I'd done for them over the years. I wasn't perfect, but I'd always tried to be a good daughter. I'd helped them with bills when I started working, offered to pay for repairs around the house, and even put off my own dreams to make sure they were okay. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. They wanted me to prove my loyalty to the family by taking on this loan. And when I refused, they acted like I'd turned my back on them entirely. It felt like all the years I'd spent trying to make them proud were erased in an instant. Looking back, I realized this was about more than just money. It was about the dynamic that had been in place my whole life. The one where my brother could do no wrong and I was expected to pick up the pieces whenever things fell apart. Saying no wasn't just a financial decision. It was me finally standing up for myself after years of being overlooked and undervalued. But at the time, all I could feel was guilt. Guilt for saying no, guilt for not being the perfect daughter they wanted, and guilt for not being able to fix everything. And yet, deep down, I knew I couldn't give in. Because if I did, it wouldn't stop here. This wouldn't be the last time they asked me to sacrifice for my brother's mistakes, and I wasn't sure I had anything left to give. After the loan argument, I thought the dust might settle eventually. I mean, sure, things were awkward. My mom's phone calls had gotten shorter, and my dad didn't bother to hide his disappointment when we did talk. But I figured they'd cool off eventually, maybe even come to their senses about the whole mess. After all, I wasn't the one who put them in this position. It wasn't like I wanted them to be struggling, but I also wasn't going to jeopardize my future for my brother's mistakes. A couple of months passed, and things were almost starting to feel normal again when my mom called and said they wanted to have a family meeting. Her tone was overly bright, like she was trying too hard to make it sound casual. "We just think it's important to get everyone on the same page," she said. That should have been my first clue that something was up. Family meetings weren't exactly our thing. When I arrived at their house, my brother was already there, lounging on the couch like he didn't have a care in the world. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him, and my mom was bustling around, making coffee like this was some kind of friendly get-together. I sat down, already bracing myself for whatever was coming. My dad started by clearing his throat and saying, "We've been doing a lot of thinking about the future." That immediately put me on edge. He went on to explain how they wanted to make things fair between me and my brother when it came to their estate. At first, I didn't see where this was going. I mean, splitting things equally seemed like the logical choice, right? But then my mom chimed in. "We want you both to share everything equally," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. "But since your brother already has the house, we thought it would only be fair to factor that into the inheritance." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "Wait," I said slowly. "Are you saying my share will be less because you already gave him the house?" They exchanged a look like they were trying to figure out how to spin this. Finally, my dad said, "It's not about giving you less. It's about making sure things are fair. Your brother doesn't have the same financial stability you do, so we wanted to make sure he gets an equal start." Equal start? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My brother had already gotten a huge leg up with the house. Never mind the endless stream of financial bailouts over the years. And now they wanted me to get less because of their decision to gift him a house they couldn't even afford outright? I tried to stay calm, but my voice was shaking as I said, "Do you not see how unfair this is? He's already gotten so much more than I have, and now you're telling me I should just accept less because you decided to give him a house?" My mom's face crumpled like I just insulted her personally. "It's not about who got what," she said. "It's about making sure everyone is taken care of. You've always been more independent, and we thought you'd understand." My brother, of course, stayed completely silent through all of this, except for the occasional shrug. When I looked at him for some kind of response, he just said, "I didn't ask them to do this." That was the final straw. "Exactly," I snapped. "You didn't ask for it, but you're perfectly fine with reaping all the benefits while I'm expected to just suck it up and be okay with less. How is that fair to me?" My dad's voice turned icy. "This isn't about fairness. It's about family. And frankly, we're disappointed that you're making this about money." That comment hit me like a slap. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about years of watching them bend over backward for my brother, while I was left to fend for myself. It was about feeling like I didn't matter as much because I wasn't the one constantly in crisis. The meeting ended in a stalemate. My parents were clearly upset that I wasn't falling in line, and my brother, well, he just went back to scrolling on his phone like none of it affected him. As I drove home, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Every time I thought about it, I got angrier. By the time I got home, I realized something important. This wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about a pattern, one that had been there my entire life. My parents always put my brother's needs first, no matter how much it hurt me or how unfair it was. And now they were doubling down on that pattern, even in death. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to just let it go. After all, fighting with my parents wasn't going to change the way they saw things. But another part of me felt like I had to stand up for myself, even if it meant causing a rift in the family. For now, though, all I could do was stew in my frustration and try to come to terms with the fact that, once again, I was the one being asked to make sacrifices for the sake of family. And honestly, I wasn't sure how much more I could take. After the inheritance meeting, things didn't just unravel, they outright fell apart. My parents barely tried to hide their disappointment in me anymore. Every conversation was laced with guilt trips or thinly veiled remarks about how I wasn't being a good daughter. My brother? He couldn't have cared less. At one point, when I tried to bring up how unfair the situation was, he smirked and said, "It's not like you need the money anyway." That comment cut deeper than I wanted to admit. To him, I was just the successful sibling who didn't have any financial struggles. He had no idea how hard I'd worked to get where I was, or how much I'd sacrificed along the way. I wasn't rolling in cash, I was just careful. I budgeted, I saved, and I made smart choices. Meanwhile, he blew through money like it was water, and I was supposed to just accept that as my role in the family. The worst part wasn't even his indifference. It was my parents' relentless defense of him. Anytime I pointed out how unfair their decisions were, they had a ready-made excuse. Your brother's had a rough time, they'd say. Or, he just needs a little help to get back on his feet. I'd heard those phrases so many times they felt like a broken record. The guilt tripping got worse. My mom had this uncanny ability to dredge up random moments from my childhood to use against me. One day, during one of her teary phone calls, she actually brought up the time I broke my arm in 5th grade. "We paid for all those hospital bills," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We never asked you to pay us back." I was stunned. Was she seriously using a childhood injury as leverage? "Mom," I said, trying to stay calm. "I was a kid. What were you supposed to do? Let me walk around with a broken arm?" But she just sighed heavily, like I was missing the point. My dad wasn't any better. He had this way of looking at me like I was the one who'd let the family down. He didn't say much directly, but his disappointment was palpable. When he did speak, it was always some variation of, "We thought we raised you better than this." It was infuriating. They were acting like my refusal to co-sign a loan or accept a smaller inheritance was some kind of moral failing. The divide between us only grew as time went on. I stopped answering their calls as often, and when I did, the conversations were short and strained. They'd ask how I was doing, but it felt perfunctory, like they were just waiting for an opening to bring up my brother again. Speaking of my brother, he was living his best life through all of this. He didn't seem to feel any guilt or responsibility for the mess he'd created. When I asked him once why he wasn't trying harder to fix things, he just shrugged and said, "It's not like I asked them to do any of this for me." That was the part that drove me crazy. He wasn't wrong. My parents had made their own choices. But he also wasn't taking any responsibility for the fact that their choices were a direct result of his actions. He'd racked up the debt, he'd failed to pay it off, and now they were bending over backward to save him. And somehow, I was the one being painted as the bad guy for not stepping in. One day, after a particularly heated argument with my mom, I decided to take a step back and really think about the situation. Why were my parents so desperate to defend my brother, even at the expense of their relationship with me? The answer, I realized, was painfully simple. They didn't see him as capable of standing on his own, and maybe, deep down, they didn't believe he ever would be. Once I saw things in that light, everything made a little more sense, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. My parents weren't just enabling my brother. They were protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. And in doing so, they were willing to sacrifice their relationship with me. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Why was I the one being punished for being responsible? Why was I expected to make sacrifices for someone who'd never lifted a finger to help himself? It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. But every time I tried to explain that to my parents, they just doubled down on their guilt trips. "We just want to make sure both of our kids are taken care of," my mom said one day during yet another argument. "Then maybe it's time you asked him to take care of himself," I shot back. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. That was the moment I realized things were never going to change. My parents had made their choice, and as much as it hurt, I couldn't keep bending over backward to meet them halfway when they weren't willing to do the same for me. The divide between us wasn't just about money. It was about years of unspoken resentment, favoritism, and a fundamental lack of understanding. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure if our relationship could survive it. After weeks of arguments, guilt trips, and stonewalling, something still wasn't adding up. My brother's debts were bad. Sure, credit cards, a car loan he defaulted on, and probably some unpaid bills, but the numbers didn't seem catastrophic. I'd seen glimpses of his situation over the years, and while it was messy, it wasn't mortgaging your future and begging your daughter for a loan bad. So, I started to wonder if there was more to the story. My parents' desperation, their willingness to risk everything, even their inheritance plans. It all felt too extreme for what I knew about my brother's debts. That curiosity turned into suspicion, and the only way to get answers was to start digging. The first clue came from a random comment my mom made during one of her teary phone calls. She said something about my brother being pressured and stressed by a bad situation a couple of years ago. When I pressed her for details, she quickly backpedaled, saying it wasn't her story to tell. That only made me more suspicious. I started with some light Googling, but there wasn't much to find. My brother's name didn't come up in any lawsuits or news articles, and there wasn't anything about him owning a failed business. But then I remembered. He'd always bragged about wanting to be his own boss. I hadn't taken it seriously, figuring it was just another one of his half-baked schemes. That's when I reached out to an old friend of his, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had been close with my brother during his entrepreneurial phase. The friend was hesitant at first, clearly unsure if he should get involved. But after some coaxing, he finally spilled the beans. Apparently, a couple of years ago, my brother had tried to start a small business, something about reselling high-end electronics. It sounded like a pyramid scheme, but my brother convinced himself it was his big break. He borrowed money from a few friends, maxed out his credit cards, and even got a loan from someone his friend cryptically described as not exactly a bank. It all fell apart within months. My brother had no idea how to run a business, and whatever profits he made disappeared almost as quickly as they came in. By the time it was over, he owed tens of thousands of dollars to various people, including some individuals who weren't exactly patient about getting paid back. Hearing all of this felt like a gut punch. It wasn't just that my brother had failed. It was that he dragged my parents into it. When I confronted my mom about what I'd learned, she broke down almost immediately. "We didn't want you to worry," she said through tears. "You have your own life to focus on." "Worry?" I shot back. "You think I'm worried?" "I'm furious. You've been covering for him while letting me think this was just about some credit card debt. How could you not tell me the truth?" She tried to explain. "It's not like we wanted to get involved, but he was scared. He owed money to people who weren't going to wait. We couldn't just leave him to deal with that alone." The more she talked, the clearer it became that they'd been bailing him out for years, not just with the house, but with loan payments, legal fees, and even direct payments to some of his creditors. They'd borrowed against their retirement savings, taken out personal loans, and were barely keeping up with their own bills because of it. When my dad got home, I confronted him too. Unlike my mom, he didn't cry or make excuses. He just said, "We did what we had to do." "No, you didn't," I snapped. "You chose to gamble your future, our future, on someone who's never proven he can be trusted. And now you're asking me to clean up the mess you made?" Their defenses crumbled under the weight of the truth. My dad admitted that they were in much deeper than they'd let on. The house wasn't just a gift for my brother. It was also a way to shield him from some of his creditors. By putting the house in his name but keeping the mortgage in theirs, they thought they were being clever. Instead, they just created a legal and financial disaster waiting to happen. My mom kept repeating that they didn't want to burden me, but it was hard to take her seriously when they were actively trying to rope me into their problems. "Do you even realize what you're asking of me?" I demanded. "You've already mortgaged everything you have for him, and now you're asking me to risk my credit and my savings because you're too scared to let him face the consequences of his own actions." They didn't have much to say to that. My mom just looked at me with tearful eyes, and my dad stared at the floor. For the first time, I think they realized just how much damage they'd done. Not just to their finances, but to our relationship. But even then, they couldn't bring themselves to hold my brother accountable. "He's not strong enough to handle this on his own," my mom said softly. "We're his parents. It's our job to protect him." "And what about me?" I asked. "Do I not matter? Do my sacrifices, my hard work, mean nothing to you?" That was the breaking point for me. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about trust, respect, and the years of favoritism that had led us to this moment. My parents had made their choice, and it was clear that they were going to keep choosing my brother, no matter how much it cost them, or me. I walked out of their house that day feeling more disconnected from them than ever before. They'd kept this massive secret from me, all while asking me to put my future on the line for a problem I didn't create. And my brother? He was still out there, living his life like none of this was his fault. As much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't keep being the one to fix everything. If my parents wanted to gamble their future on my brother, that was their decision. But I wasn't going to let them drag me down with them. And for the first time, I started to wonder if walking away from all of it was the only way to protect myself. The call from the bank came out of nowhere. I was at work, trying to focus on a project, when my phone started buzzing. Normally, I wouldn't answer an unknown number during work hours, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end introduced themselves as a fraud investigator from my bank. My heart immediately sank. "Ms. Last name," the agent said. "We wanted to verify a loan application submitted in your name. It's flagged because the details seem unusual." "A loan application?" My mind raced. I hadn't applied for any loans. The agent went on to explain that someone had used my personal information to try and secure a sizable loan. The application had been submitted online, but the system had flagged it due to discrepancies in the contact details provided. "Who would?" I began, and then it hit me. My stomach churned as the realization dawned. "Can you tell me more about the details submitted?" The agent couldn't give me much, but what they did share was enough to confirm my worst fear. The contact email? My mother's. The phone number? A landline. My parents' house number. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the day. My hands were shaking as I forwarded the fraud alert email to myself and jotted down notes from the call. By the time I got home, I was practically vibrating with anger. I called my mom first. She picked up after 2 rings, her voice cheerful as though nothing was wrong. "Hi, sweetie," she said, like she wasn't actively trying to ruin my life. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Did you or Dad try to take out a loan in my name?" I asked, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. There was a long pause, and then she sighed. "Oh," she said quietly, like she'd been caught sneaking cookies from the jar. "We were going to tell you, but—" "You what?" I snapped. "You were going to tell me after you committed fraud? After you tried to put me on the hook for a loan I didn't authorize?" "Calm down," she said, her tone defensive now. "We weren't trying to hurt you. We knew you'd say no if we asked, and we didn't have any other options." My blood boiled. "So your solution was to go behind my back? To commit fraud? Do you even realize what could have happened if the bank hadn't flagged it?" She brushed me off like I was the one overreacting. "It's not fraud, honey. You're our daughter. We weren't stealing. We just needed some help, and you're in a position to provide it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mom was trying to rationalize what they'd done as if it wasn't a massive betrayal of trust. The worst part? She didn't even seem sorry. When I demanded to speak to my dad, he got on the phone and doubled down on their defense. "You're being dramatic," he said in his usual no-nonsense tone. "We knew you'd say no, so we had to try something else. It's not like we were going to default on it." "That's not the point," I yelled. "You went behind my back, used my personal information without my consent, and tried to take out a loan in my name. Do you even hear yourselves right now? You've never had to worry about money," my dad said, as if that somehow justified their actions. "We just needed a little help, and you're acting like we committed a crime." "That's because you did commit a crime," I shouted. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you could have gotten me into?" They were silent after that, probably because they didn't have a real defense. I hung up, shaking with anger and disbelief. Over the years, I'd put up with a lot from my parents: the favoritism, the guilt trips, the constant expectation that I'd sacrifice my needs for my brothers. But this was a new low. I knew I couldn't let it slide. The next morning, I called them back and said, in no uncertain terms, that I was done. "I'm not your scapegoat," I said firmly. "I'm not your solution to the mess you've created, and I'm not going to keep pretending like this is okay." My mom started crying, of course. "We didn't mean to hurt you," she sobbed. "We just didn't know what else to do." "That's not my problem anymore," I said, my voice cold and steady. "You made your choices, and now you have to deal with the consequences. I'm done being dragged into this." My dad tried to pull the ungrateful card again, but I shut him down. "This has nothing to do with gratitude," I said. "This is about trust, and you broke it. I don't owe you anything, especially not after this." As for my brother, when he heard about the fallout, he had the audacity to say I was overreacting. "It's not like they were trying to screw you over," he said with a shrug. "They were just trying to help me out." "You're really going to hold that against them?" His complete lack of accountability was the final nail in the coffin. "You've never taken responsibility for anything in your life," I told him. "And now you've managed to drag our parents down with you. But you're not dragging me down too. I'm done." Walking away wasn't easy. Cutting ties with my parents felt like cutting off a part of myself, but I knew it was the only way to protect my peace of mind. I blocked their numbers for a while, stopped taking calls from relatives who tried to mediate, and focused on rebuilding the trust I'd lost in myself. It hurt to know that my parents saw me as nothing more than a safety net for my brother's failures. But for the first time, I realized I had the power to say no, and to mean it. Their choices were theirs to live with, just as mine were mine to protect. And while it didn't feel good in the moment, it felt necessary. Because if they couldn't respect me enough to ask for help honestly, they didn't deserve my help at all. After cutting ties with my parents, I hoped things would calm down. Maybe they'd reflect on what they'd done, realize they'd crossed a line, and leave me alone for a while. But that was wishful thinking. Within a week, the phone calls started, not from them, but from other family members. It began with my aunt, the self-appointed family mediator. "I just got off the phone with your mother," she said in a tone so disapproving I could practically hear her frown. "She told me everything. How could you turn your back on them during a time like this?" I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath before responding. "Did she also tell you they tried to take out a loan in my name without my consent?" I asked. There was a pause, just long enough to tell me that my mom had conveniently left that part out. "Well," my aunt said cautiously, She mentioned something about a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I repeated, incredulous. Using my personal information to apply for a loan without telling me isn't a misunderstanding, it's fraud. And that's just the latest thing. They've been lying to me for years about the situation with my brother, and I'm done being their scapegoat. My aunt tried to argue, saying things like, "But they're your parents, and families have to stick together." It was exhausting. I realized pretty quickly that she wasn't really interested in hearing my side. She just wanted me to fall back in line so things could go back to normal. It wasn't just her. Over the next few weeks, I got calls from aunts, uncles, cousins, some I hadn't spoken to in years, all of them weighing in on the situation. Some were sympathetic once I explained what had really happened, but others didn't want to hear it. They'd already made up their minds based on whatever version of the story my parents had fed them. "They're struggling," one uncle told me, his voice dripping with judgment. "And you're in a position to help. Why wouldn't you step up?" "I have stepped up," I snapped. "For years, I've been the one picking up the slack while my brother coasted. But this is too far. I can't keep sacrificing my future because they refuse to hold him accountable." He didn't have much to say to that, but the damage was already done. The calls left me feeling drained and isolated, like I was losing not just my immediate family but my extended family too. It was hard to shake the feeling that I was being painted as the villain in a story I hadn't written. Meanwhile, my brother was living his life like nothing had happened. Not once did he reach out to check on me, apologize, or even acknowledge the situation. If anything, he seemed relieved that I was out of the picture. It meant he didn't have to deal with my negativity, as he so charmingly put it during one of our last conversations. The fact that he could just move on without a second thought said everything I needed to know about where we stood. I'd spent years bending over backward to be a good sister, trying to help him even when he didn't deserve it. But to him, I was nothing more than an obstacle, a roadblock in his endless quest to avoid responsibility. As much as it hurt, it was also liberating. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the struggling younger brother I'd been trying to save, but as someone who would never change because he didn't have to. Our parents had made sure of that, shielding him from consequences at every turn, and he had no reason to start taking responsibility now. Still, the fallout took its toll. I found myself replaying the events in my head over and over, questioning if I'd done the right thing. Was I really being selfish, as everyone seemed to think? Should I have just sucked it up and gone along with their plans for the sake of keeping the peace? But every time I started to doubt myself, I came back to one simple truth. I hadn't created this mess. My parents had. My brother had. And for years, I'd done everything in my power to help fix it. But no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. I started seeing a therapist, which helped more than I expected. She helped me unpack the guilt I'd been carrying for years, guilt that wasn't really mine to bear. "It's not selfish to set boundaries," she told me during one session. "In fact, it's necessary. You can't pour from an empty cup." That phrase stuck with me. I'd been pouring from an empty cup for so long, trying to fix everyone else's problems while ignoring my own needs. But now, for the first time, I was learning how to protect myself, even if it meant disappointing the people I cared about. As the weeks turned into months, the calls from family members started to taper off. Some of them came around after hearing the full story, while others quietly distanced themselves. I stopped trying to defend myself to people who weren't interested in hearing the truth. My relationship with my parents was all but non-existent. Occasionally, my mom would send me a text, usually something vague and guilt-inducing like, "I hope you're doing okay. We miss you." I never responded. It was painful, but it was also necessary. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't constantly bracing for the next guilt trip or wondering how I was going to dig myself out of someone else's mess. I was finally free to focus on my own life, my own goals, and my own happiness. The fallout had been brutal, but it taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is walk away, but sometimes, it's also the only thing you can do. And for the first time, I was learning how to put myself first. I didn't see the text right away. It came in the middle of a particularly hectic day at work, buried beneath emails and notifications. But when I finally glanced at my phone, the message stopped me in my tracks. "Hey, it's your cousin Emily. Can we talk? I heard about everything going on, and I just want you to know I'm on your side." Emily and I weren't particularly close. We'd see each other at family gatherings and exchange the occasional text, but we'd never been confidants. So her message was completely unexpected, especially after weeks of feeling like I was fighting the entire family on my own. I didn't respond right away. Part of me was wary, What if this was some kind of trap? Another attempt to guilt me into backing down? But something about the tone of her message felt genuine. So later that evening, I called her. From the moment she picked up, it was clear she wasn't trying to ambush me. "I've been hearing bits and pieces about what's going on," she said, her voice cautious but kind. "And I just want to say, I think what your parents are doing is completely unfair." I nearly burst into tears right then and there. For weeks, I'd been surrounded by accusations of selfishness and betrayal, with barely anyone bothering to hear my side of the story. And now, here was someone, not just anyone, but a family member, acknowledging how wrong it all was. "Thank you," I said, my voice shaking. "You have no idea how much it means to hear that." Emily told me she'd spoken to both my parents and some of our other relatives. While she didn't know all the details, she'd heard enough to know that I wasn't the villain my parents were making me out to be. "They're framing it like you've abandoned them," she said. "But when I pressed them on why you're so upset, they got really cagey." That's when I knew there was more to the story. I explained everything to her: the loan, the inheritance meeting, the years of favoritism, and the final straw of them trying to take out a loan in my name. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she let out a low whistle. "Wow," she said. "That's a lot. No wonder you're done." As the conversation continued, Emily opened up about her own experiences with family drama. While her situation wasn't as extreme, she'd had her own run-ins with manipulation and unfair expectations. "It's like there's this unspoken rule that we're supposed to sacrifice everything for family, even when it's toxic," she said. "But you're allowed to set boundaries. You shouldn't feel guilty for protecting yourself." Her words hit me like a lifeline. For so long, I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was being too harsh or ungrateful. Hearing Emily validate my feelings was like a weight lifting off my chest. She also gave me some practical advice. "You might want to talk to a lawyer," she suggested, "just in case. If your parents were willing to try taking out a loan in your name, there's no telling what else they might do. It's better to be prepared." The idea of consulting a lawyer hadn't even occurred to me, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My parents had already crossed so many lines. What if they tried something even more drastic? Over the next few days, Emily and I kept in touch. She checked in regularly, offering support and even helping me draft a letter to my parents outlining my boundaries. She was careful not to push too hard, letting me take the lead, but her encouragement was exactly what I needed. For the first time in months, I started to feel like I could breathe again. I wasn't alone in this fight, not entirely at least. Knowing that someone in my family saw things from my perspective made all the difference. With Emily's help, I found a lawyer and scheduled a consultation. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. My parents' attempt to take out a loan in my name was a serious breach of trust and potentially illegal. She walked me through steps I could take to protect myself, including putting alerts on my credit and drafting a formal letter warning my parents to stop using my personal information without consent. The process was intimidating, but it also felt empowering. For so long, I'd felt helpless, trapped in a cycle of guilt and obligation. Taking concrete steps to protect myself was a reminder that I had agency, that I wasn't powerless. Meanwhile, Emily became my sounding board for everything. When I had doubts, she reassured me. When I felt overwhelmed, she reminded me to take things one step at a time. And when I started to feel the pangs of guilt creeping back in, she didn't hesitate to call out the toxic patterns that had led to this point. "You've been carrying this burden for way too long," she said during one of our late-night phone calls. "It's okay to let it go. You don't have to fix everything, or everyone." Her words stuck with me. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be the good daughter, the responsible sibling, the one who always stepped up when no one else would. But maybe it was time to let go of that role. Maybe it was okay to prioritize my own well-being for once. The conversation with Emily was a turning point. It didn't magically fix everything. My relationship with my parents was still strained, and the fallout with the rest of the family was far from resolved. But it gave me the strength to keep going, to stand firm in my decision even when it felt like the world was against me. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. After weeks of soul-searching and endless conversations with Emily, I realized it was time to take control of my life. For far too long, I'd let guilt and obligation dictate my actions, bending over backward to accommodate my parents and their toxic dynamics. But now, I understood that protecting myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. One evening, I sat down and wrote a letter to my parents. It wasn't an angry tirade or a list of grievances. It was a clear, calm explanation of where I stood and what I needed moving forward. In the letter, I told them I loved them, but I couldn't continue to be their financial safety net or their emotional punching bag. I explained that I would no longer discuss money, loans, or inheritance with them. If they wanted to have a relationship with me, it would have to be based on mutual respect and healthy boundaries. The letter was hard to write. I second-guessed myself with every sentence, wondering if I was being too harsh or if I'd regret cutting them off from such a significant part of my life. But with Emily's encouragement, I pressed on. By the time I sealed the envelope, I felt a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Delivering the letter was another matter entirely. I couldn't bring myself to hand it to them in person, knowing they'd try to argue or guilt me into changing my mind. So, I left it in their mailbox and sent my mom a text. "I left a letter for you and Dad. Please read it when you have time." It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. That evening, my phone lit up with calls and texts from my parents. I ignored them at first, wanting to give them time to process what I'd written. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I answered a call from my dad. His tone was icy. "So, this is how it's going to be?" he asked, skipping any pleasantries. "You're just going to walk away from your family because things got a little tough?" "This isn't about walking away," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's about setting boundaries. I can't keep putting myself in the middle of your problems, especially when it's clear you're not willing to change." "You sound just like one of those therapists," he snapped. "Boundaries? That's just an excuse to be selfish." I bit back the urge to yell. "It's not selfish to protect myself," I said firmly. "I've been giving and giving for years, and it's never enough. I'm done being dragged into a mess I didn't create." My mom, of course, took a different approach. When she called the next day, she was crying, loud, theatrical sobs that made my chest tighten with guilt. "Do you even realize what you're doing to this family?" she wailed. "We've always been there for you, and now you're abandoning us when we need you most." "I'm not abandoning you," I said, though my voice cracked under the weight of her accusation. "I'm still here. I just can't be part of this anymore. I love you, but I need to take care of myself too." "But we're your parents," she cried. "You're supposed to take care of us, not the other way around." That comment made my blood boil. "Do you even hear yourself right now?" I snapped. "You're asking me to take care of you while you destroy your own lives trying to protect my brother. When is he going to take responsibility for anything? When are you going to hold him accountable?" She didn't have an answer. Instead, she pivoted, accusing me of being cold-hearted and selfish, the same words my dad had used. It stung, but I refused to let her derail the conversation. Over the next few days, I held firm, even as the backlash from my parents intensified. My dad sent me long, guilt-laden texts about how he'd sacrificed everything for me growing up, as if that justified everything they were doing now. My mom left voicemails that alternated between tearful pleas and passive-aggressive jabs. It was exhausting, but I knew I couldn't give in. I kept reminding myself of everything they'd done, how they tried to take out a loan in my name, how they'd lied to me for years, and how they'd continued to prioritize my brother at my expense. If I caved now, I'd be right back where I started, stuck in a cycle of guilt and resentment. The hardest part was knowing that standing my ground might mean losing them for good. As much as I hated the way they treated me, they were still my parents. A part of me held on to the hope that they'd eventually come around, that they'd see how much their actions had hurt me and try to make amends. But I couldn't wait for that day to come. I had to move forward, even if it meant leaving them behind. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice a change in myself. I felt lighter, freer, like I'd been carrying a heavy burden for years without realizing it. Setting boundaries wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I focused on rebuilding my life, reconnecting with friends, and pursuing hobbies I'd neglected for too long. Emily was a constant source of support, always reminding me that I wasn't alone. "You're stronger than you think," she told me during one of our phone calls. "Don't let them make you doubt that." Her words became a mantra for me. Every time I felt the pull of guilt or the sting of my parents' accusations, I reminded myself that I was doing the right thing, not just for me, but for the version of myself I wanted to be. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my parents, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done letting their choices define my life. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own story. Months have passed since I set those boundaries, and the dust has finally started to settle, at least as much as it ever will. My relationship with my parents remains distant, and I haven't spoken to my brother at all. At first, the silence felt unnatural, like something was missing. But over time, I realized it wasn't peace that felt foreign. It was the chaos I'd grown so used to living in. I won't lie and say everything is perfect. There are still moments when the weight of it all creeps in. Family gatherings are a minefield I now avoid entirely, knowing my presence or absence will spark whispers and judgment. I hear things secondhand from Emily or other relatives. My parents still talk about me, framing me as the difficult child who abandoned the family. My brother? He's apparently the same as always, floating through life with no real plans or responsibilities. The difference is that now, their narratives don't control me. I've stopped worrying about how they see me or whether I'll ever measure up to their impossible expectations. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living for myself. Focusing on my own life has been a revelation. It started small, setting aside time for things I love, like reading and hiking, and reconnecting with friends I'd unintentionally drifted away from. I threw myself into work, not out of necessity, but because I finally had the mental space to think about my career in a meaningful way. And then there were the bigger changes. I started traveling, something I'd always dreamed of but never felt I could justify. The first trip was a weekend getaway with friends, a spur-of-the-moment decision that reminded me how much joy there is to be found in spontaneity. From there, it grew. A solo trip to the mountains, a week abroad immersing myself in a culture I'd always been curious about. Each experience felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost in the chaos of my family's expectations. The biggest shift, though, has been internal. Setting boundaries with my parents forced me to confront some hard truths about myself. How much of my identity had been tied up in being the good daughter, the responsible one, the fixer. Letting go of that role wasn't easy. There were days when I felt untethered, like I didn't know who I was without that constant push to prove myself. But over time, I started to see those moments of uncertainty for what they were. Opportunities to redefine myself. I wasn't just the fixer anymore. I was someone who deserved happiness, peace, and self-respect. Someone who didn't need to carry everyone else's burdens to have value. Do I wish things had turned out differently? Of course. No one grows up dreaming of estrangement or wishing for a fractured family. In a perfect world, my parents would have understood my perspective, taken responsibility for their actions, and made genuine efforts to repair our relationship. My brother would have stepped up, acknowledging his role in the chaos and working to fix his own mistakes. But this isn't a perfect world, and I've come to terms with that. Sometimes, people don't change, not because they can't, but because they don't want to. And as much as that realization hurts, it's also freeing. I've stopped hoping for the apology that will probably never come. Instead, I've chosen to focus on the things I can control, my own actions, my own growth, and my own happiness. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. There are still moments when the past feels heavy, like a shadow I can't quite shake. A random song or a passing comment from a friend will bring back memories of happier times. Family dinners filled with laughter, holiday mornings when everything felt simple and safe. Those moments remind me that things weren't always bad, which makes the current reality all the harder to accept. But I've also learned to honor those memories without letting them pull me back into a toxic cycle. They're part of my story, but they don't define my present or my future. I've started to notice the little things that show how far I've come. I sleep better at night, unburdened by the constant anxiety of wondering what crisis will come next. I laugh more, genuinely and without reservation, because my life is no longer weighed down by guilt and obligation. And most importantly, I've learned to trust myself, to make decisions that prioritize my well-being, even when they're hard. If standing up for myself makes me the bad guy in my parents' eyes, so be it. I can live with that. What I couldn't live with was continuing to sacrifice my peace of mind for people who didn't respect my boundaries. For the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. Not because everything is resolved, but because I've learned to let go of what I can't change and focus on what I can. And if that's the cost of protecting myself, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. This journey hasn't been easy, but it's taught me one thing above all else. Sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that lead to the most growth. And for that, I'm grateful.